forgotten world that came before us. Somewhere in the quiet halls of a museum, behind glass that reflects the modern world back at itself, rests a clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks. The marks are cuneiform, one of humanity's first attempts to capture thought in physical form. The tablet is small, unassuming, easily overlooked among the grander relics of ancient empires. But the words pressed into that clay thousands of years ago tell a story so strange, so unsettling, that scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain it away. It's called the Sumerian King List, and if you read it carefully, if you let its words settle into your mind without rushing to dismiss them, you begin to realize that it doesn't sound like mythology at all. It sounds like memory. The list begins in a time before the flood, a great deluge that appears in stories across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to the Bible, from India to the Americas. But before that flood, according to the king list, there were kings. Rulers who sat on thrones in cities whose names still echo through history. Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These were not mythical places. Archaeologists have found them. They were real cities, built by real hands, occupied by real people. But the kings who ruled them, their reigns stretch across time in ways that defy everything we think we know about human life. One king ruled for 28,000 years, another for 43,000. The shortest reign listed before the flood lasted a mere 18,600 years. And then the flood came. The waters rose, the world ended. When the waters receded and kingship descended from the heavens once more, something had changed. The new kings, the ones who ruled after the flood, lived lifetimes that sound almost human. A few hundred years, a few dozen. Some ruled for less than a decade. It's as though the very nature of existence had shifted, as though time itself had been reset, and humanity had to begin again under different rules. The question that haunts anyone who reads the Sumerian king list is simple, and it echoes across millennia. What happened? What kind of world existed before the flood, where kings could reign for tens of thousands of years? And why does this ancient text, carved into clay by scribes who lived closer to that lost world than we do, insist that it was real? The Sumerian king list was not discovered all at once. It exists in fragments, scattered across time and geography, pieced together from multiple clay tablets found in different locations throughout Mesopotamia. The most complete version was unearthed in the early 20th century during excavations in the ancient city of Nippur, located in what is now southern Iraq. Nippur was a sacred city, a place of temples and learning, where scribes copied and preserved the knowledge of their civilization. The tablet found there, known as the Well-Blundell Prism, is a four-sided clay column covered in cuneiform script. It was created around 2000 BCE, during the reign of the Yisin dynasty, but the information it contains is far older. The scribes who carved it were not inventing a story. They were copying from earlier sources, texts that had been passed down through generations, perhaps even millennia. The king list was not a work of fiction to them. It was a historical record, as real and authoritative as any chronicle of kings and dynasties. Other fragments of the king list have been found in cities like Ur, Lhasa, and Kish. Each version varies slightly, with different kings emphasized or omitted depending on which city-state commissioned the text. But the core structure remains the same, a chronological list of rulers beginning in the distant past before the flood and continuing down through history to the time of the scribes themselves. What makes the king list so extraordinary is not just its age, but its format. It reads like a bureaucratic document, dry and matter-of-fact, listing each king's name, the city where he ruled, and the length of his reign. There is no embellishment, no poetic language, no attempt to glorify or mythologize. It simply states the facts as the Sumerians understood them. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 20 AC 800 years. That's how it begins, not with a creation myth or a story of God shaping the world, but with a straightforward declaration, kingship came from the heavens, and the first king ruled for nearly 29,000 years. The list continues in this manner, moving from one king to the next, one city to the next, until it reaches the flood. Then, after a brief acknowledgement that the flood swept over the land and kingship had to descend from heaven once more, the list resumes. But now the numbers are different. The reigns are shorter. The world has changed. Scholars have long struggled with how to interpret the king list. The standard explanation is that the antediluvian kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, are mythological figures, symbolic representations of a distant, idealized past. The enormous lengths of their reigns, according to this view, are not meant to be taken literally. They are exaggerations, perhaps intended to convey the idea that these early rulers were semi-divine, closer to the gods than to ordinary humans. But that explanation raises as many questions as it answers. If the antediluvian kings are purely mythological, why does the king list treat them exactly the same way it treats the later, historically verified kings? Why is there no shift in tone? No indication that the scribes considered the early kings any less real than the later ones? And why do the post-flood kings, whose reigns are still extraordinarily long by modern standards, but far shorter than their predecessors, gradually transition into rulers whose lifespans match those of actual historical figures? The king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a record that begins in a time so distant, so different from our own, that the very fabric of existence was not what it is today. And then something happened, something catastrophic, something that changed the world, and after that time moved differently. Life moved differently. Humanity moved differently. What if the Sumerians weren't exaggerating? What if they were remembering? To understand the weight of that question, you have to step back and consider what Sumer was. This was not a primitive society stumbling towards civilization. When Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, it arrived almost fully formed, with cities, temples, irrigation systems, and a written language. The Sumerians had laws, mathematics, astronomy, literature. They built ziggurats that reached toward the sky, massive stepped pyramids that served as bridges between the earthly and the divine. And they had memory. They remembered a time before their cities, before their writing, before the flood. They remembered kings who ruled in an age that felt more like legend than history. Yet they recorded those kings with the same precision they used to record everything else. The flood itself is central to the king list, and it's central to Sumerian mythology as a whole. The most famous account of the flood comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature. In that story, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a great deluge, but one man, Utnapishtim, is warned by the god Enki. He builds a boat, saves his family and representatives of all living creatures, and survives the flood. When the waters recede, he is granted immortality by the gods. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah are impossible to ignore, and scholars have long recognized that the Genesis flood narrative likely has its roots in earlier Mesopotamian traditions. But the Sumerian king list adds another layer to the story. It doesn't just tell us that a flood happened. It divides all of history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. It treats the flood as a boundary, a moment when the old world ended and a new one began. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, they didn't. That's not a metaphor. That's a statement of fact, at least as the Sumerians understood it. Something fundamental changed when the flood came. The world that existed before was not the same as the world that came after. What kind of world could that have been? What kind of civilization could produce kings who reigned for millennia? And why would the Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers, insist that such a world was real? One possibility is that the antediluvian kings represent entire dynasties rather than individual rulers. Perhaps each name on the list is not a single person, but a lineage, a family, or clan that held power for thousands of years. The enormous lengths of their reigns would then make more sense. They would be the cumulative reigns of many rulers compressed into a single name. But that explanation doesn't quite fit. The king list is very specific about individual kings. It names them, tells us where they ruled, and gives us exact numbers for their reigns. If the scribes had meant to represent dynasties, they could have said so. They didn't. They treated each king as a distinct individual, just as they did with the later, historically verified rulers. Another possibility is that the numbers are symbolic, encoded with astronomical or mathematical significance. Some researchers have suggested that the lengths of the antediluvian reigns correspond to cycles of the heavens, precessions, planetary alignments, or other celestial phenomena that the Sumerians, who were skilled astronomers, might have been tracking. In this view, the king list is not a historical record at all, but a kind of cosmic calendar, a way of marking time on a scale far grander than human lifespans. That's an intriguing idea, and there's some evidence to support it. The Sumerians were obsessed with the heavens. They track the movements of the stars and planets with remarkable precision, and their mythology is filled with references to celestial events. The number 3600, which appears frequently in Sumerian texts, is thought to represent a sar, a unit of time associated with the orbit of a hypothetical planet or celestial body. Some of the reigns listed in the king list are multiples of 3600, which suggests that the numbers might indeed have astronomical meaning. But even if the numbers are symbolic, that doesn't mean the kings themselves were fictional. It's possible that the Sumerians were doing both, recording real rulers while also embedding deeper layers of meaning into the lengths of their reigns. Ancient texts often operate on multiple levels, blending history, mythology, and cosmology into a single narrative. The king list might be no different. And then there's the simplest, most unsettling possibility of all. What if the Sumerians were telling the truth? What if there really was a time, long before recorded history, when human beings, or beings like us, lived far longer than we do now? What if the antediluvian kings were real, and their extraordinary lifespans were not exaggerations but accurate reflections of a world that no longer exists? That idea sounds impossible. It contradicts everything we know about biology, about aging, about the limits of human life. But the Sumerians didn't know they were supposed to find it impossible. They simply recorded what they believed to be true, based on the knowledge that had been passed down to them from their ancestors. And their ancestors in turn had received that knowledge from those who came before them, stretching back into a past so distant that it fades into shadow. What if the shadow is where the truth lies? The Sumerian king list is not the only ancient text that speaks of impossibly long lifespans. Across the ancient world, in cultures that had no contact with one another, similar stories appear. In the Bible, the book of Genesis lists 10 patriarchs who lived before the flood, and their lifespans are staggering. Adam lived for 930 years. Seth lived for 912 years. Methuselah, the longest lived of them all, reached 969 years before he died. After the flood, the lifespans of the patriarchs drop sharply. Noah's descendants lived for a few hundred years, then a few dozen, until eventually human lifespans settled into the range we recognize today. The parallels between the biblical patriarchs and the Sumerian king list are striking. Both texts divide history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. Both describe a time when human beings, or at least certain exceptional individuals, lived far longer than they do now. And both suggest that the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a turning point, a moment when the rules of existence changed. In ancient Egypt, the Turin King List, also known as the Turin Royal Canon, records the reigns of gods and semi-divine beings who ruled before the first human pharaohs. These divine rulers are said to have reigned for thousands of years, much like the antediluvian kings of Sumer. The list then transitions to the reigns of human kings, whose lifespans are far shorter. Once again, we see the same pattern, a distant past populated by beings who lived on a timescale that seems impossible, followed by a shift to a more recognizable human history. In India, the ancient Puranas describe cycles of time called yugas, vast epochs during which the nature of existence changes. In the earliest yuga, the Satya Yuga, or Golden Age, human beings lived for thousands of years and possessed abilities that seem almost godlike. As the yugas progressed and the world declined, human lifespans grew shorter and the connection between humanity and the divine weakened. By the time of the Kali Yuga, the current age, humans live for only a few decades, and the world is filled with suffering and ignorance. Even in the Americas, far removed from the civilizations of the Old World, similar stories appear. The Maya and Aztec traditions speak of previous worlds or ages, each of which ended in catastrophe. The beings who inhabited those earlier worlds were different from modern humans, taller, stronger, longer lived. When each world was destroyed, a new one began, and the people of the new world were diminished, less than what had come before. These stories, scattered across continents and millennia, all share a common theme: the idea that humanity's distant past was fundamentally different from the present. There was a time when people lived longer, when the world was closer to the divine, when the boundaries between gods and humans were not as rigid as they are now. And then something happened, a flood, a cataclysm, a cosmic shift, and the old world ended. What came after was smaller, shorter, more fragile. Why do these stories exist? Why do cultures that never met, that developed independently on opposite sides of the planet, all tell variations of the same tale? One explanation is that these are universal myths, archetypes that arise naturally from the human psyche. The idea of a lost golden age, a time of perfection that was destroyed and can never be reclaimed, is a powerful narrative. It speaks to a deep longing within us, a sense that something has been lost, that we are living in the shadow of a greater past. From this perspective, the Sumerian king list and the biblical patriarchs and the Egyptian god kings are all expressions of the same psychological need, a way of imagining a time when life was better, longer, more meaningful. But there's another explanation, one that's harder to dismiss. What if these stories are not myths at all? What if they are memories, distorted, fragmented, passed down through countless generations, but memories nonetheless? What if there really was a time, long before recorded history, when the world was different, when human beings, or beings like us, lived in ways we can no longer imagine? And what if the flood, the cataclysm that appears in so many ancient texts, was a real event, a disaster so catastrophic that it reset human civilization, wiping out almost everything that came before. The geological record tells us that massive floods have occurred throughout Earth's history. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. The resulting sea level rise was dramatic, flooding coastal regions and river valleys around the world. Some researchers believe that this event, or a series of related events, could be the source of the flood myths that appear in so many ancient cultures. But the Sumerian king list suggests something more specific. It doesn't just say that a flood happened, it says that the flood marked a boundary between two different kinds of existence. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, they didn't. That's not just a story about rising water. That's a story about a world that ended and a new world that began in its place. What if the antediluvian kings were not human in the way we understand the term? What if they were something else? Survivors of an earlier civilization, perhaps, or beings who existed in a time when the conditions of life on Earth were radically different? What if the Sumerians, when they recorded the king list, were preserving the last remnants of knowledge from that lost world? Knowledge that had been passed down through the survivors of the flood? These are not comfortable questions. They push against the boundaries of what we're willing to accept as possible. But the Sumerian king list doesn't care about our comfort. It simply exists, carved into clay, waiting for us to decide what it means. The city of Eridu holds a special place in Sumerian tradition. According to the king list, it was the first city to receive kingship from the heavens. It was where civilization began, where the gods first taught humanity the arts of writing, building, and governance. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed a settlement that dates back to at least 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest known cities in the world. At the heart of Eridu stood a temple dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. Enki was one of the most important deities in the Sumerian pantheon, a god who loved humanity and often intervened to protect them from the wrath of the other gods. In the flood myth, it was Enki who warned Utnapishtim of the coming deluge, giving him the knowledge he needed to survive. The temple at Eridu was rebuilt many times over the centuries, each new structure built on top of the ruins of the old. Archaeologists have uncovered at least 17 layers of construction, stretching back thousands of years. The earliest layers are simple shrines, small structures made of mud brick. But even in those earliest layers, there is evidence of ritual activity, of offerings made to the gods, of a people who believed they were living in a sacred place. Why was Eridu considered the first city? Why did the Sumerians believe that kingship descended from heaven there and nowhere else? The answer might lie in the city's location. Eridu was built near the edge of the marshes, where the Euphrates River met the Persian Gulf. It was a place of transition, a boundary between land and water, between the human world and the realm of the gods. In Sumerian cosmology, water was the source of all life, the primordial substance from which the world was created. Enki, the god of water, was the god of beginnings, the one who brought order out of chaos. If Eridu was the first city, then Alulim, the first king, was the first human to receive the gift of kingship from the gods. According to the king list, he ruled for 800 years. That number is not random. It's a multiple of 3600, the sacred Sar, a unit of time that appears throughout Sumerian texts. Some researchers believe that the Sa represents a great cosmic cycle, a period during which the heavens complete a full rotation and return to their starting point. If that's true, then Alulim's reign might represent not just a single lifetime, but an entire age, a vast span of time during which the first city flourished under the guidance of the gods. But what does it mean to say that kingship descended from heaven? The Sumerians were not speaking metaphorically. They believed quite literally that the gods lived in the sky, in a celestial realm above the earth. Kingship was a divine gift, a sacred responsibility bestowed upon certain individuals by the gods themselves. The king was not just a political leader. He was a mediator between the human and divine worlds, a figure who maintained the cosmic order through ritual and sacrifice. The idea that kingship came from the heavens appears in other ancient cultures as well. In Egypt, the pharaoh was considered a living god, a divine being who ruled on earth as the representative of the gods. In China, the emperor held the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule that could be revoked if he failed to govern justly. In Mesoamerica, the rulers of the Maya and Aztec civilizations claimed descent from the gods and performed elaborate rituals to maintain the balance between the earthly and celestial realms. But the Sumerian king list goes further. It doesn't just say that kings were chosen by the gods, it says that kingship itself, as an institution, as a concept, came from the heavens. Before kingship descended, there were no kings. There was no organized society, no cities, no civilization. And then, at a specific moment in time, in a specific place, Eridu, the gods gave humanity the gift of kingship and everything changed. What if that's not mythology? What if it's history? What if there really was a moment when human society underwent a sudden dramatic transformation? When people who had been living as hunter-gatherers or simple farmers suddenly began building cities, developing writing, creating complex social hierarchies? And what if that transformation was so rapid, so unprecedented, that the only way the Sumerians could explain it was to say that it came from the gods? Modern archaeology has struggled to explain the sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization. Around 4000 BCE, the region that would become Sumer was inhabited by small farming communities. By 3500 BCE, those communities had grown into cities with populations in the thousands, with monumental architecture, advanced irrigation systems, and a written language. The transition happened in the span of a few centuries, a blink of an eye in archaeological terms. Where did the Sumerians come from? Where did they learn to build ziggurats, to write in cuneiform, to organize their society into complex bureaucracies? The standard answer is that these developments were gradual, the result of centuries of slow innovation and cultural evolution. But the archaeological record doesn't quite support that narrative. Sumerian civilization appears suddenly, almost fully formed, with little evidence of the intermediate stages we would expect to see. Some researchers have suggested that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an earlier, unknown civilization, a culture that existed before them and passed down its wisdom through oral tradition or lost texts. Others have proposed that the Sumerians were influenced by contact with other advanced societies, perhaps from the Indus Valley or the Iranian Plateau, but there's no clear evidence for either of these theories. And then there's the king list, sitting quietly in its museum case, insisting that the answer is simpler than we think. Kingship descended from heaven. The gods gave humanity the knowledge it needed to build cities, to write, to govern. The first kings ruled for thousands of years, guiding their people through an age that we can barely imagine. And then the flood came, and the old world ended, and humanity had to start again. What if the Sumerians were right? The flood is the pivot point of the king list, the moment when everything changes. Before the flood, the reigns of the kings stretch across millennia. After the flood, they contract sharply. The first post-Diluvian king, Joshua of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years, still an extraordinary lifespan, but a fraction of what came before. His successors ruled for even shorter periods, and within a few generations the reigns had dropped to a few hundred years, then a few dozen. The flood itself is described briefly in the king list, almost as an aside. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. That's all. No details about the flood itself. No description of the destruction it caused. No explanation of why it happened. The scribes simply acknowledged that it occurred and then moved on to the next dynasty. But the brevity of that statement is deceptive. The flood was not a minor event in Sumerian tradition. It was the defining catastrophe of their history, the moment when the old world ended and the new world began. The Epic of Gilgamesh devotes an entire section to the flood, describing how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Utnapishtim built his boat, how the waters rose and covered the earth, and how, when the flood finally receded, Utnapishtim made a sacrifice to the gods and was granted immortality. The flood appears in other Sumerian texts as well. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest known flood myths, tells a similar story. The gods create humanity. Humanity grows too numerous and too noisy. The gods decide to send a flood to wipe them out, but one man is warned and survives. The details vary from text to text, but the core narrative remains the same. The flood was real. It happened, and it changed everything. Why did the gods send the flood? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the god Enlil is disturbed by the noise of humanity, the constant clamour of human activity, the endless bustle of cities and farms and markets. He convinces the other gods to destroy humanity with a flood, to wipe the slate clean and start over. But Enki, the god of wisdom, takes pity on humanity. He warns Utnapishtim, tells him to build a boat, and ensures that at least some humans survive. In the Eridu Genesis, the reason for the flood is less clear. The text is fragmentary, and much of it has been lost. But the surviving portions suggest that the gods were concerned about humanity's rapid growth, about the way human civilization was spreading across the earth. The flood was a way of resetting the balance, of preventing humanity from becoming too powerful, too numerous, too much like the gods themselves. That's a strange motivation for a divine catastrophe. Why would the gods be threatened by human progress? Why would they want to limit humanity's growth? Unless, of course, humanity was on the verge of discovering something, some knowledge, some power, that the gods wanted to keep hidden. The story of the Tower of Babel, found in the biblical book of Genesis, offers a similar theme. Humanity, speaking a single language and working together, begins to build a tower that reaches toward heaven. The tower is a symbol of human ambition, of the desire to ascend to the realm of the gods. But God sees the tower and is troubled. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, God says. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So God confuses their language, scatters them across the earth, and the tower is never completed. The message is clear. There are limits to what humanity is allowed to know, to achieve, to become. When those limits are approached, the gods intervene. They send a flood, They scatter the people. They reset the world. What if the flood described in the Sumerian king list was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act? What if it was a way of ending a civilization that had grown too advanced, too knowledgeable, too close to the secrets of the gods? And what if the antediluvian kings, with their impossibly long reigns, were the leaders of that civilization, beings who possessed knowledge and abilities that we can no longer imagine? The idea that an advanced civilization existed before recorded history is not new. It appears in the writings of Plato, who described the lost continent of Atlantis, a powerful, technologically advanced society that was destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods. Plato claimed that the story of Atlantis had been passed down from ancient Egyptian priests, who said that it had occurred 9,000 years before their time, placing it around 9600 BCE. Modern scholars generally dismiss Atlantis as a myth, a philosophical allegory that Plato invented to illustrate his ideas about the ideal state. But what if Plato was recording a genuine tradition, a memory of a real civilization that was destroyed in a cataclysm? What if the flood described in the Sumerian king list, the deluge of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the destruction of Atlantis are all different versions of the same event, a global catastrophe that wiped out an advanced civilization and forced the survivors to start over from scratch? The geological evidence for such a catastrophe is tantalizing but inconclusive. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the Earth underwent dramatic climate changes. Massive ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, and coastal regions around the world were flooded. Some researchers believe that this period, known as the Younger Dryas, was triggered by a comet impact or a series of impacts that caused widespread destruction and climate disruption. If a comet struck the Earth around 12,000 years ago, it would have caused tsunamis, wildfires, and a sudden drop in global temperatures. Coastal civilizations would have been wiped out almost instantly. The survivors would have been scattered, their cities and monuments buried beneath rising seas or destroyed by the impact itself. Within a few generations, the memory of what had been lost would have faded into myth. But some memories would have survived. Oral traditions passed down from parent to child, from generation to generation, would have preserved fragments of the old knowledge. And when writing was finally invented thousands of years later, those traditions would have been recorded, imperfectly, incompletely, but recorded nonetheless. The Sumerian king list might be one of those records, a distant echo of a world that existed before the flood, before the ice melted, before the old civilization was swept away. What if the antediluvian kings were the rulers of that lost civilization? What if their impossibly long reigns represent not individual lifespans, but the duration of their dynasties, their cultures, their cities? What if the Sumerians, when they carved the king list into clay, were preserving the last remnants of a history that stretched back to the very dawn of human civilization, and perhaps even before? The transition from the antediluvian kings to the post-diluvian kings is abrupt, but it's not absolute. The first kings after the flood still lived for centuries, far longer than any human today. Jusha of Kish ruled for 200 years. His successor, Kulasina-Bel, ruled for 960 years. The third king, Nangishli-Shma, ruled for 670 years. The numbers are still extraordinary, still far beyond the limits of human biology as we understand it, but they're declining. With each generation, the reigns grow shorter, as though the world is slowly returning to normal, slowly settling into the rhythms of existence that we recognize today. By the time the king list reaches the third dynasty after the flood, the reigns have dropped to a few hundred years. By the fifth dynasty, they're down to a few dozen, and by the time we reach the kings of the Akkadian Empire, around 2300 BCE, the reigns are entirely plausible. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. These are lifespans that match the historical record, that align with what we know about the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia. The king list doesn't explain why the reigns grew shorter. It simply records the change, as though it were a natural process, an inevitable consequence of the flood. But the pattern is striking. It's as though the flood didn't just destroy the old world, it fundamentally altered the conditions of existence. Whatever allowed the antediluvian kings to live for tens of thousands of years was gone. The new world was different, smaller, more limited. Humanity had to adapt to a new reality, one in which life was shorter, knowledge was scarcer, and the connection to the divine was more distant. What could cause such a change? If we take the king list at face value, if we assume that the antediluvian kings really did live for thousands of years, then something about the pre-flood world must have been radically different from the post-flood world. The environment, the atmosphere, the very fabric of reality, something was different, and the flood marked the moment when that difference ended. Some researchers have speculated that the Earth's atmosphere was once richer in oxygen, or that the planet's magnetic field was stronger, or that cosmic radiation levels were lower. Any of these factors could, in theory, have extended human lifespans by reducing cellular damage and slowing the aging process. If the flood was accompanied by a dramatic shift in environmental conditions, perhaps triggered by a comet impact or a massive volcanic eruption, then those conditions could have changed, and human lifespans could have shortened as a result. But that's speculation, not evidence. There's no clear proof that the Earth's atmosphere or magnetic field was significantly different 12,000 years ago, and even if it was, it's hard to imagine how such changes could extend human lifespans to the degree described in the king list. 28,000 years is not just a long life, it's a geological timescale, a span of time during which entire civilizations could rise and fall. Another possibility is that the antediluvian kings were not entirely human. In Sumerian mythology, the gods often interacted with humanity, sometimes taking human form, sometimes mating with human women and producing hybrid offspring. The Anunnaki, a group of deities associated with the heavens and the underworld, were said to have descended to Earth and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Some researchers have suggested that the antediluvian kings might have been Anunnaki, or descendants of the Anunnaki, beings who are part god and part human, and who therefore lived far longer than ordinary mortals. This idea is echoed in the biblical book of Genesis, which describes the Nephilim, giants who walked the earth in the days before the flood. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, Genesis says, and also afterward when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Nephilim are often interpreted as the offspring of angels and humans, beings who possessed extraordinary strength and longevity, but who were ultimately destroyed in the flood. The parallels between the Nephilim and the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list are striking. Both are described as living in the time before the flood. Both are associated with extraordinary abilities and lifespans, and both are said to have been wiped out when the flood came, leaving only a few survivors to carry on the human race. What if the antediluvian kings were the Nephilim? What if they were the mighty men of old, the rulers of a lost civilization that existed before the flood? And what if the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of divine judgment, a way of wiping out a race of beings that had become too powerful, too dangerous, too much like the gods themselves? These are not questions that can be answered with certainty. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, too open to interpretation. But the fact that these stories exist, that they appear in multiple cultures and multiple texts, suggests that they are rooted in something real, some memory, some event, some truth that has been passed down through the ages. The Sumerian king list is not just a list of names and numbers. It's a window into a lost world, a world that existed before history, before writing, before the flood. And if we're willing to look through that window, if we're willing to set aside our assumptions and our skepticism, we might catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. A civilization that rose and fell long before our own, a time when the boundaries between gods and humans were not as clear as they are now, and a catastrophe that reset the world and forced humanity to begin again. The city of Kish holds a special place in the post-Diluvian section of the king list. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, and this time it landed in Kish, a city located near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Kish became the first capital of the New World, the place where civilization was reborn after the waters receded. Archaeological excavations at Kish have revealed evidence of a major flood that occurred around 2900 BCE. A thick layer of sediment, deposited by floodwaters, separates the earlier layers of the city from the later ones. This flood layer has been found at other Mesopotamian sites as well, including Ur and Shuruppak, suggesting that a widespread inundation occurred in the region during this period. Some scholars believe that this flood is the historical basis for the flood myths of Mesopotamia. It was a real event, a catastrophic deluge that destroyed cities and killed thousands of people. The survivors would have passed down stories of the flood, and over time those stories would have been embellished and mythologized, eventually becoming the epic narratives we find in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Sumerian king list. But the flood layer at Kish dates to around 2900 BCE, which is thousands of years after the end of the last ice age and the dramatic sea level rise that occurred around 12,000 years ago. If the flood described in the king list is the same as the flood layer found at Kish, then the antediluvian kings could not have lived tens of thousands of years ago. They would have lived only a few centuries before the flood, which would make their impossibly long reigns even more difficult to explain. On the other hand, if the flood described in the king list is not the same as the flood layer at Kish, then we're left with two separate floods, one that occurred around 2900 BCE and destroyed the cities of Mesopotamia, and another, much earlier flood that marked the end of the antediluvian age. The earlier flood would have been far more catastrophic, a global or near-global event that wiped out an entire civilization and left only scattered survivors to rebuild. The idea of multiple floods is not without precedent. Many ancient cultures describe a series of cataclysms, each one destroying the world and forcing humanity to start over. The Hindu Puranas describe cycles of creation and destruction, with each cycle ending in a great deluge. The Maya believed that the world had been created and destroyed multiple times, with each new world inhabited by a different race of beings. Even the Bible hints at multiple catastrophes, with the flood of Noah being only one of several divine judgments that reshaped the earth. What if the flood described in the Sumerian king list is not a single event, but a memory of multiple floods, compressed into a single narrative? What if the antediluvian kings lived through a series of catastrophes, each one more devastating than the last, until finally the world they knew was swept away entirely. And what if the survivors of those catastrophes carried with them the knowledge of what had been lost, preserving it in oral traditions and eventually recording it in texts like the King List? The more you examine the King List, the more questions it raises. Every answer leads to another mystery. Every explanation opens up new possibilities. It's as though the text itself is a puzzle, a riddle left behind by the Sumerians for future generations to solve, and the key to solving it might lie not in the text itself, but in the world that produced it, the world of ancient Mesopotamia, where gods and humans walked side by side, where the boundaries between myth and history were fluid, and where the past was not something to be forgotten, but something to be remembered, honoured, and preserved. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Sumerian King List is the way it blends myth and history so seamlessly. The early kings, with their impossibly long reigns, seem like mythological figures, beings from a distant, idealized past. But as the list progresses, the kings become more and more recognizable as historical figures. By the time we reach the kings of the Akkadian Empire, we're dealing with rulers whose names appear in other historical records, whose deeds are documented in inscriptions and monuments, whose reigns can be dated with reasonable accuracy. This transition from myth to history is not abrupt. It's gradual, almost imperceptible. The reigns grow shorter, the kings become more human, but there's no clear line where mythology ends and history begins. It's as though the Sumerians didn't see a distinction between the two. To them, the antediluvian kings were just as real as the kings of their own time. The only difference was that the antediluvian kings lived in a different world, under different conditions, and their lives reflected that difference. Modern historians tend to draw a sharp line between myth and history. Myth is fiction, a story invented to explain the world or to convey moral lessons. History is fact, a record of events that actually happened. But the Sumerians didn't think that way. For them, myth and history were two sides of the same coin, two ways of understanding the past. Myth was the story of the gods, the cosmic forces that shape the world. History was the story of humans, the kings and heroes who lived within that world. But both were real, both were true, and both were worth remembering. This blending of myth and history is not unique to Sumer. It appears in many ancient cultures. The ancient Greeks, for example, believed that the Trojan War was a real historical event, even though it was also the subject of epic poems filled with gods, monsters, and supernatural events. The ancient Egyptians recorded the reigns of their pharaohs alongside the reigns of gods and semi-divine beings, treating both as part of a continuous historical narrative. The ancient Chinese chronicled the deeds of legendary emperors who were said to have ruled for hundreds of years, and they saw no contradiction between those legends and the more recent, historically verified dynasties. What if this blending of myth and history is not a sign of primitive thinking, but a more sophisticated understanding of the past? What if the ancients recognized that history is not just a collection of facts, but a story, a narrative that we construct to make sense of the world? And what if they understood that some truths can only be expressed through myth, through stories that transcend the literal and speak to deeper realities? The Sumerian King List might be one of those stories. It might be a way of saying that the past is not just a series of events, but a journey from a time when the world was young and the gods were close, to a time when the world grew old and the gods withdrew. The antediluvian kings, with their impossibly long reigns, represent that distant mythical past. The post-Diluvian kings, with their gradually shortening lifespans, represent the transition to the historical present. And the flood, the great catastrophe that divides the two, represents the moment when the old world ended and the new world began. But even if the king list is a myth, that doesn't mean it's not true. Myths are not lies. They're stories that convey truths too complex or too profound to be expressed in simple, literal terms. The truth of the king list might not lie in the exact numbers, in the precise lengths of the reigns, but in the pattern those numbers reveal. The pattern of a world that was once different, that changed, that was lost, and that we are still trying to understand. In recent years, some researchers have proposed that the Sumerian king list might contain encoded astronomical data. The idea is that the lengths of the antediluvian reigns correspond to celestial cycles, precessions, planetary orbits, or other astronomical phenomena that the Sumerians were tracking. If this is true, then the king list is not just a historical record, but a kind of cosmic calendar, a way of marking time on a scale far grander than human lifespans. The Sumerians were skilled astronomers. They tracked the movements of the stars and planets with remarkable precision, and they developed a sophisticated system of mathematics based on the number 60, which is still used today in our measurement of time and angles. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over thousands of years. They observed the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the planets, and they used that knowledge to create calendars, to predict eclipses, and to time their agricultural activities. Some of the numbers in the king list are multiples of 3,600, which, as mentioned earlier, is thought to represent a psalm, a unit of time associated with the celestial cycle. If the antediluvian reigns are based on SARs rather than years, then the numbers become more manageable. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years, for example, would be 8 SARs. If a SAR represents a specific astronomical cycle, perhaps the orbit of a planet or the precession of the equinoxes, then the king list might be recording not the lifespans of individual kings, but the duration of astronomical ages. This interpretation is intriguing, but it raises as many questions as it answers. If the king list is an astronomical text, why is it framed as a list of kings? Why not simply record the celestial cycles directly, without the need for royal names and dynasties? And why do the post-diluvian reigns gradually decrease, rather than remaining constant multiples of the SAR? One possible answer is that the Sumerians were doing both, recording history and encoding astronomical data at the same time. Ancient texts often operate on multiple levels, with surface meanings and hidden meanings layered on top of each other. The king list might be a historical record that also serves as a mnemonic device, a way of preserving astronomical knowledge in a form that could be passed down through generations. But there's another possibility, one that's even more speculative. What if the astronomical cycles recorded in the king list are not just abstract measurements of time, but markers of real events, cosmic events that had a direct impact on the Earth and on human civilization? What if the antediluvian reigns correspond to periods of stability, when the Earth's orbit and climate were relatively constant, and the flood marks a moment when that stability was disrupted? Some researchers have suggested that the Earth has experienced periodic catastrophes caused by comets, asteroids, or other celestial bodies. These catastrophes would have caused widespread destruction, climate change, and mass extinctions. If the Sumerians were aware of these cycles, If they had inherited knowledge of past catastrophes from an earlier civilization, then the king list might be a way of recording that knowledge. A warning, perhaps, that the cycles will repeat, that the catastrophes will come again. This idea is highly controversial, and it's not supported by mainstream science. But it's worth considering, if only because it offers a way of making sense of the king list's strange numbers and its insistence that the antediluvian kings were real. If the king list is recording cosmic cycles, then the impossibly long reigns are not exaggerations. They're accurate measurements of time on a scale that transcends individual human lives. What if the Sumerians knew something we've forgotten? What if they understood that the Earth is subject to cycles of destruction and renewal, and that human civilization is only one chapter in a much longer story? And what if the king list is their way of telling us that story, of passing down the knowledge they inherited from those who came before? The deeper you go into the Sumerian king list, the more it feels like you're descending into a labyrinth, a maze of names and numbers and half-remembered stories, all pointing towards something just beyond reach. Every time you think you found an answer, the answer dissolves, and you're left with more questions. What were the antediluvian kings? Why did they live so long? What was the flood and what did it destroy? And why did the Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers, insist that all of this was real? Perhaps the answer is that the king list is not meant to be solved. Perhaps it's meant to be pondered, to be meditated upon, to be carried with us as a reminder that the past is not as simple or as knowable as we like to think. The Sumerians lived closer to that past than we do. They were only a few thousand years removed from the events they were recording, and they had access to traditions and texts that have since been lost. If they believed that the antediluvian kings were real, if they believed that the flood was a turning point in human history, then maybe we should take them seriously. That doesn't mean we have to accept everything in the king list as literal truth, but it does mean we should be open to the possibility that the Sumerians knew things we don't, that they preserved memories of a world we can no longer see. The king list is not just a curiosity, not just an ancient text to be filed away in a museum. It's a message from the past, a message that says, we were here, we remember, and what we remember is important. What if the antediluvian kings were the last remnants of a lost civilization, a civilization that existed before the flood and was destroyed by it? What if the Sumerians, when they built their cities and developed their writing, were not starting from scratch, but rebuilding, carrying forward the knowledge and traditions of those who came before? And what if the king list is the last surviving record of that lost world, the only text that still remembers the kings who ruled before the flood, before history, before the world as we know it began? These are not questions that can be answered with certainty. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous. But the questions themselves are worth asking because they force us to reconsider our assumptions about the past. We tend to think of history as a linear progression, a steady march from primitive beginnings to modern civilization. But what if history is not linear? What if it's cyclical, with civilizations rising and falling, knowledge being gained and lost, and humanity starting over again and again? The Sumerian king list suggests that possibility. It suggests that the world we live in is not the first world, that there were others before us, and that those earlier worlds were not necessarily less advanced or less sophisticated than our own. They were just different. And when they ended, when the flood came and swept them away, the survivors had to rebuild from the ruins, carrying with them only fragments of what had been lost. What if we are the descendants of those survivors? What if the knowledge we take for granted, Writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture was not invented by us, but inherited from those who came before. And what if the Sumerian king list is one of the few texts that still remembers where that knowledge came from? There's a haunting quality to the king list, a sense of loss that permeates every line. The antediluvian kings are gone. The world they ruled is gone. The flood swept it all away, and what came after was smaller, shorter, more fragile. The Sumerians, when they recorded the king list, were not just preserving history, they were mourning. They were mourning a world they had never known, a world that existed only in memory and myth, but a world that felt more real, more vital, more alive than the one they inhabited. That sense of loss is something we can still feel today, thousands of years later. We live in a world that is constantly changing, constantly moving forward, constantly leaving the past behind. But there's a part of us that longs for something older, something deeper, something that connects us to the very beginning of human existence. The Sumerian king list speaks to that longing. It reminds us that we are not the... What if the king list is not just a record of the past, but a map of cycles it describes? The rise and fall of kings, the coming of the flood, the slow decline of human lifespans are not unique to the ancient world, but patterns that repeat throughout history. And what if we are living through one of those cycles right now, moving toward another turning point, another moment when the world will change and everything we know will be swept away? These are uncomfortable thoughts. They challenge our sense of progress, our belief that we are moving forward, that we are building something permanent and lasting. But the Sumerian king list suggests other. If they recorded their history, if they carved it into clay and buried it in the earth, then some last gift you can give is of where you came from. The Sumerian king list ends not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. The list of kings goes on. It doesn't truly end. It simply stops, as though the story is still being written, as though the list of kings will continue into the future long after the Sumerians themselves have vanished. That open-endedness is a record of an ongoing process, a journey that began in the distant past and continues into the present. The antediluvian kings are gone, but their memory remains. The flood swept away the old world, but the new world rose from its ruins. And the cycle continues, generation after generation, king after king, until one day perhaps another flood will come, and the cycle will begin again. What if the Sumerian king list is not just a record of the past, but a prophecy? What if it's telling us that the patterns of history repeat, that the rise and fall of civilizations is not random but cyclical, and that we are living through one of those cycles right now? What if the antediluvian kings, with their impossibly long reigns, represent a time of stability and prosperity that we have lost, and the gradual shortening of lifespans represents a decline that we are still experiencing? These are questions that the king list raises but does not answer, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the king list is not meant to give us answers, but to make us think, to make us question, to make us wonder about the nature of time, the nature of history, and the nature of our own existence. It's a text that refuses to be pinned down, that resists easy interpretation, that remains as mysterious and enigmatic today as it was when it was first carved into clay 4,000 years ago. And maybe that's why it endures. Maybe that's why we're still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still searching for the truth hidden within its lines. because the Sumerian king list is not just a list of kings, it's a mirror, reflecting back to us our own questions about where we came from, who we are, and where we're going. It's a reminder that the past is not something separate from us, but something that lives within us, shaping our present and our future in ways we can barely comprehend. What if the key to understanding the Sumerian king list is not to solve it, but to live with it, to carry it with us as a question, a mystery, a puzzle that we may never fully solve, but that enriches our understanding of the world nonetheless? What if the greatest gift the Sumerians left us is not the answers they recorded, but the questions they asked? Late at night, when the world is quiet and the mind begins to drift, it's easy to imagine the antediluvian kings. You can see them in your mind's eye, sitting on thrones in cities that no longer exist, ruling over a world that has been lost to time. You can imagine the flood rising, the waters covering the land, the old world disappearing beneath the waves, and you can imagine the survivors clinging to whatever they could save, carrying with them the memory of what had been lost. The Sumerian king list is their legacy. It's the story they told, the record they kept, the message they left for us. And if we listen carefully, if we let the words sink in, we might hear something more than just a list of names and numbers. We might hear the echo of a world that once was, a world that existed before history, before writing, before the flood. A world where kings ruled for thousands of years, where the gods walked among humans, and where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible were not as clear as they are now. What if that world was real? What if the Sumerian king list is not mythology, not exaggeration, not symbolic encoding, but memory, distorted by time, fragmented by catastrophe, but memory nonetheless? What if the antediluvian kings really did exist, and their impossibly long reigns are a reflection of a world that operated under different rules, different conditions, different laws of nature? We may never know for certain. The evidence is too scarce, the past too distant, the truth too deeply buried. But the question remains, carved into clay, waiting for us to discover it, to ponder it, to carry it with us into the future. The Sumerian king list is not just a text, it's a doorway, a portal into a past that we can barely imagine, but that continues to call to us, to haunt us, to remind us that there is more to history than we have been taught. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery itself is the message. Perhaps the Sumerians, when they recorded the king list, were not trying to give us answers, but to give us something more valuable, a sense of wonder, a sense of possibility, a sense that the world is far older and far stranger than we can ever fully comprehend. So as you drift towards sleep, as the words of the king list fade into the background of your mind, let yourself wonder. Wonder about the antediluvian kings, about the world they ruled, about the flood that swept them away. Wonder about the survivors, about the knowledge they carried, about the stories they told, and wonder about us, about our place in the long, unbroken chain of human history, about what we will leave behind when our own civilization has crumbled and our own cities have turned to dust. The Sumerian king list holds no definitive answers, but it holds something more important, a question that echoes across the millennia, a question that each generation must answer for itself. What if the past is not what we think it is? What if there were others before us, greater than us, wiser than us, who knew things we've forgotten? And what if the key to understanding our future lies not in looking forward, but in looking back, into the shadows of the earliest past, where the truth still waits to be discovered. The king list is still there, resting in its museum case, covered in dust and time. But the story it tells is not over. It's still being written, still being discovered, still being remembered. And as long as there are people willing to ask the questions, willing to wonder, willing to imagine a world that existed before history began, the Sumerian king list will continue to speak to us, whispering its secrets across the ages, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting to be found. But what if we've been asking the wrong questions all along? What if the mystery of the Sumerian king list isn't about whether the numbers are literal or symbolic, whether the kings were real or mythological, whether the flood was local or global? What if the real mystery is why we find it so difficult to accept that the Sumerians might have been telling the truth as they understood it? We live in an age of radical skepticism, where the default position toward ancient texts is disbelief. We assume that ancient peoples were superstitious, that they couldn't distinguish between fact and fiction, that their records are riddled with errors and exaggerations. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the Sumerians were just as rational, just as careful, just as committed to accuracy as any modern historian? They were, after all, the inventors of writing itself. They created one of the world's first legal systems, developed advanced mathematics, tracked the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. These were not primitive people. They were sophisticated, organized, meticulous. So when they recorded that Elulim ruled for 2800 years, they weren't being careless. They weren't confusing mythology with history. They were recording what they believed to be true, based on sources that they considered reliable. The question we should be asking is not whether the Sumerians were wrong, but why their understanding of the past was so radically different from ours. One possibility we haven't fully explored is that the Sumerians were measuring time differently than we do, not just using different units, sars instead of years, but conceptualizing time itself in a fundamentally different way. In the modern world, we think of time as linear, uniform, constant. A year is a year, whether it occurred in 2000 BCE or 2000 CE. Time flows at the same rate for everyone, everywhere, always. But what if that's not how the Sumerians understood time? What if they believed that time itself was variable, that it could flow faster or slower depending on cosmic conditions, divine intervention, or the state of the world? In that case, a year in the antediluvian period might not be equivalent to a year in the post-diluvian period. The two might be measuring the same thing, a cycle of seasons perhaps, or a celestial revolution, but the duration of that cycle might have been different. This idea might sound absurd to modern ears, but it's not without precedent. Einstein's theory of relativity tells us that time is not absolute, that it can be stretched or compressed depending on velocity and gravity. Time passes more slowly near a massive object, more quickly in the vacuum of space. An astronaut orbiting the Earth ages slightly slower than someone on the ground. Time, in other words, is relative. Could the Sumerians have known something about the relativity of time? Could they have inherited knowledge from an earlier civilization that understood that time is not constant, that it can change? If the antediluvian world existed during a period when the Earth's relationship to the sun was different, when the planet's rotation was faster or slower, when the magnetic field or cosmic radiation levels created different conditions, then time itself might have been experienced differently. A year might have been shorter or longer. Life processes might have unfolded at a different rate. This is admittedly highly speculative, but it's no more speculative than dismissing the entire king list as mythology. At least this approach takes the Sumerians seriously, treats them as intelligent observers trying to make sense of information that had been passed down to them from their ancestors. Another avenue worth exploring is the nature of kingship itself in the antediluvian period. We assume that the kings listed in the king list were individuals, single human beings who ruled for impossibly long periods. But what if king meant something different before the flood? What if it referred not to a person, but to a principle, a system, a continuity of rule that transcended individual lifetimes? In many traditional societies, the king is not just a political leader, but a sacred figure, a living embodiment of the cosmic order. When a king dies, the kingship doesn't die. It passes to the successor, who becomes, in a sense, the same king. The individual changes, but the office remains. In ancient Egypt, every pharaoh was Horus incarnate. In Tibet, the Dalai Lama is believed to be the reincarnation of his predecessor, the same consciousness returning in a new body. The person is temporary, but the essence is eternal. What if the antediluvian kings were understood in this way? What if Alulim was not the name of a single individual, but a title, a position, a sacred office that was occupied by a succession of rulers who were all considered to be Alulim? In that case, the 2800-year reign would not be the lifespan of one person, but the duration of the Alulim dynasty, the total span of time during which that particular line of kingship held power. This interpretation has the advantage of making the numbers more comprehensible, without dismissing them as purely mythological. It allows us to take the king list seriously as a historical record, while acknowledging that the Sumerians might have been recording history in a way that's different from our modern conventions. The antediluvian section would then represent very long dynasties, or political systems that remained stable for thousands of years, while the post-diluvian section would represent shorter dynasties that change more frequently. But even this interpretation raises questions. If the antediluvian kings represent dynasties, why did those dynasties remain stable for so long? What kind of society could maintain the same ruling family, the same system of government, the same continuity of power for thousands of years? Our own experience tells us that political systems are fragile, that empires rise and fall, that revolutions and upheavals are inevitable. The longest-lasting dynasties in recorded history, the Zhou dynasty in China, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, lasted for a few centuries at most. The idea of a single dynasty ruling for 28,000 years seems almost as impossible as a single individual living that long. Unless, of course, the antediluvian world was fundamentally more stable than our own. If the climate was constant, if resources were abundant, if there were no wars or plagues or natural disasters to disrupt the social order, then perhaps a dynasty could last for millennia. The antediluvian period might have been a golden age, a time of peace and prosperity when the world was in balance and kingship was truly ordained by the heavens, not contested by ambitious rivals or threatened by external enemies. And then the flood came, and that stability was shattered. The post-diluvian world was a world of chaos, of struggle, of constant change. Dynasties rose and fell more quickly because the world itself was more volatile. The connection between heaven and earth had been severed, or at least weakened, and kingship was no longer the stable, eternal institution it had once been. There's another pattern in the king list that deserves closer attention: the gradual transition from the mythical to the historical. It's not just that the reign lengths decrease over time, the nature of the information changes as well. The antediluvian kings are listed with minimal detail: name, city, reign length, that's all. No accomplishments, no genealogies, no stories. They're bare bones, skeletal entries that tell us almost nothing about who these kings were or what they did. But as the king list moves forward in time, the entries become richer. We start to get patronymics, son of so-and-so, which establish genealogical connections. We get epithets and titles that tell us something about the king's character or achievements. We get references to specific events, battles, building projects. By the time we reach the historically verified kings of the late 3rd millennium BCE, the entries are detailed enough to cross-reference with other sources to build a coherent picture of Mesopotamian history. This gradual enrichment of detail suggests that the king list is based on sources of varying quality and age. The antediluvian entries are the oldest, the most distant from the scribes who recorded them, and therefore the most sparse. The information has been compressed, reduced to its essential elements, stripped of context and elaboration. What survives is just the core. These were the kings, this is where they ruled, this is how long they ruled. But even in that compression, there's information. The fact that the antediluvian kings are remembered at all, that their names were preserved across such vast stretches of time, suggests that they were important enough that their memory endured through the catastrophe of the flood, through the collapse and rebuilding of civilization, through countless generations of oral transmission before writing was invented. These were not minor figures. They were the founding fathers of Sumerian civilization, the legendary rulers whose reigns established the template for all kingship that came after. And their names have meaning. Alulim, the first king, might be related to the Sumerian word for stag or ram, animals associated with strength and virility. Enmenluana, the second antediluvian king, has a name that might mean Lord of the Powers of the Sky. Enmengalana, the sixth king, could mean Lord of the Great Crown of Heaven. These are not random names. They're titles that suggest a sacred cosmic dimension to kingship, a connection to the divine powers that governed the universe. The cities where the kings ruled are equally significant. Eridu, the first city, was sacred to Enki, the god of wisdom and water. Bad Tibira was associated with metalworking and the arts of civilization. Larak was a cult center for the god Pabilsag, a warrior deity. Sippar was the city of the sun god Shamash, the god of justice and truth. Shurupak was the city of Utnapishtim, the flood hero who survived the deluge and was granted immortality. These cities represent different aspects of civilization, different divine principles, different spheres of knowledge and power. Taken together, they form a complete picture of the antediluvian world, a world where each city was a sacred center, a place where a particular god was worshipped, and a particular king maintained the connection between heaven and earth. The antediluvian period in this reading was an age when the divine order was manifest on earth, when the gods walked among humans, or at least were closer, more accessible, and when kingship was a direct expression of cosmic law. Let's consider for a moment the possibility that the flood described in the king list was not a meteorological event at all, but something else, something that we've been interpreting too literally. In ancient Mesopotamian thought, water was not just H2O. Water was the primordial chaos, the formless void from which the world was created. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the universe begins with two primordial waters, Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt water. These waters mix and give birth to the gods, and eventually the god Marduk slays Tiamat and creates the world from her body. Water, in this cosmology, represents the dissolution of form, the return to chaos, the end of order. A flood, then, is not just a physical disaster, it's a cosmic event, a moment when the ordered world collapses and returns to the primordial state. When the Sumerians said that the flood swept over, they might have been describing not just rising waters, but a complete breakdown of civilization, a return to chaos and formlessness from which a new world had to be created. This interpretation helps explain why the flood is such a sharp dividing line in the king list. It's not just that the waters rose and killed a lot of people, it's that the entire cosmic order was reset. The antediluvian world operated according to one set of principles, one relationship between gods and humans, one understanding of time and kingship. The flood dissolved all of that, swept it away, returned everything to the primordial waters, and when the waters receded, a new world emerged, still connected to the old world through memory and tradition, but fundamentally different, operating under new rules. In this reading, the impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings are not anomalies that need to be explained away. They're accurate descriptions of a different mode of existence. The antediluvian world was closer to the divine source, closer to the moment of creation, and therefore time itself operated differently. As the world aged, as it moved further from the initial creative act, time accelerated. The reigns grew shorter because the world itself was changing, aging, moving toward the dissolution that would eventually come with the flood. And after the flood, in the new world, time moved faster still. The first post-Diluvian kings lived for centuries, but their descendants lived for decades. The world was speeding up, moving away from the timeless realm of the gods and toward the fully temporal realm of mortal humanity. The king list, in this interpretation, is a record of that acceleration, that gradual separation of the human and divine realms. There's a strange detail in some versions of the king list that often gets overlooked. The phrase, "then the kingship was taken to" a particular city. This phrase appears repeatedly as the list moves from one dynasty to the next. After Eridu, the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. After Bad Tibira, the kingship was taken to Larak, and so on. The passive voice is important here. The kingship is not seized, not conquered, not claimed. It is taken, moved from one place to another by an unspecified agent. The implication is that kingship is a portable thing, something that can be transferred from city to city. But who is doing the transferring? The obvious answer in Sumerian cosmology is the gods. Kingship descends from heaven, and it can be moved from place to place according to divine will. This raises an intriguing possibility. What if the antediluvian section of the king list is not describing a succession of dynasties that replaced each other through conquest or inheritance, but a deliberate rotation of power? What if kingship was meant to move from city to city, each city taking its turn as the center of the world, each king ruling until the gods decided it was time to pass the kingship to the next city? In this scenario, the impossibly long reigns make a different kind of sense. If kingship was supposed to remain in each city for a predetermined period, a great cosmic cycle perhaps, then those periods might naturally be very long. The king didn't die and pass power to an heir. He ruled until the completion of his city's cycle, at which point the kingship was taken to the next city, and the next king began his reign. This would also explain why there's no mention of violence or conflict in the antediluvian section. The transitions between kings are peaceful, orderly, almost ritualistic. There are no wars, no rebellions, no usurpations. The kingship simply moves from one place to the next, following a pattern ordained by the gods. And then the flood came, and that orderly pattern was destroyed. In the post-diluvian world, kingship was no longer passed peacefully from city to city according to divine will. It was fought over, conquered, seized by force. The king list records several instances of cities destroying each other, of dynasties being overthrown, of kingship being smitten with weapons and taken by conquest. The post-diluvian world was a world of violence and competition, a world where the divine order had broken down and human ambition had taken its place. We keep coming back to this question. What was different about the antediluvian world? What made it possible for kings to rule for thousands of years, for cities to coexist peacefully, for civilization to remain stable across vast stretches of time? One answer that we haven't fully considered is that the antediluvian world had fewer people. Modern scholarship estimates that the total human population before the advent of agriculture was somewhere between 1 and 10 million people worldwide. That's roughly the current population of a single large city, spread across the entire globe. Even after the agricultural revolution, population growth was slow. By 5000 BCE, the estimated global population was still only around 5 to 20 million. By 3000 BCE, perhaps 50 million. If the antediluvian cities were small, a few thousand people at most, then the social dynamics would have been completely different from anything we're familiar with. Everyone would have known everyone else, or at least known of them. Social relationships would have been direct and personal, not mediated through complex bureaucracies or anonymous institutions. A king ruling over a few thousand people would have been more like a village elder than a modern head of state. In such a society, stability would be easier to maintain. There would be less social stratification, less inequality, less potential for conflict. Resources would be abundant relative to population, so there would be less competition, less violence, less need for war. If everyone has enough to eat, if there's enough land for everyone, if there are no external threats, then why would the social order ever change? A dynasty could indeed last for thousands of years if there was simply no pressure forcing it to end. And the king himself, or the succession of kings bearing the same name, might live unusually long lives simply because the conditions were ideal. Good nutrition, low stress, absence of epidemic diseases, a stable and supportive community, all of these factors would contribute to longevity. If we add to that the possibility that the antediluvian world had different environmental conditions, perhaps higher oxygen levels, lower cosmic radiation, a stronger magnetic field, then lifespans of several hundred years start to seem at least theoretically possible. Not 28,000 years, of course. But perhaps the Sumerians, working backward from oral traditions and fragmentary records, had lost track of how many kings had actually ruled under each royal name. What they knew was that the line of Alulim had ruled in Eridu for a very, very long time. So long that the number seemed more like a cosmic cycle than a human lifespan. So they recorded it as a Sar, or 8 Sars, and let the number speak for itself. But there's a darker possibility that we need to consider. What if the flood was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of destruction? The Epic of Gilgamesh tells us that the gods decided to destroy humanity because they had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. Enlil, the king of the gods, convinced the other deities to send the flood to wipe out the human race. Only Enki dissented, warning Utnapishtim and giving him the means to survive. Why would the gods want to destroy humanity? This standard interpretation is that humans were disturbing the gods' peace, that the constant noise and activity of human civilization was intolerable to the divine beings. But there might be another reason. The gods were afraid. In several ancient texts, there are hints that humanity was on the verge of becoming too powerful, too knowledgeable, too much like the gods themselves. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu slay the Bull of Heaven, the goddess Ishtar is furious not just because they killed her sacred animal, but because they demonstrated that humans could challenge and defeat divine forces. In the story of the Tower of Babel, God scatters humanity specifically because nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. What if the antediluvian civilization had reached a level of advancement that threatened the gods? What if humans had discovered secrets, developed technologies, achieved understandings that were supposed to remain in the divine realm? The long reigns of the antediluvian kings might reflect not just stability, but progress, a steady accumulation of knowledge and power for thousands of years, an ascent towards something that the gods found dangerous, and so the gods sent the flood. Not as punishment for sin, not because humans were evil, but because humans were becoming too powerful. The flood was a reset button, a way of knocking humanity back down to a more manageable level. The antediluvian knowledge was lost, the cities were destroyed, the long-lived kings were swept away, and humanity had to start over from scratch. But some knowledge survived. Utnapishtim survived, carrying with him memories of the world before the flood. Other survivors scattered across the globe preserved fragments of the old wisdom, and when civilization was rebuilt, when the Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia and created their cities and their writing, they were not starting from zero. They were recovering, rebuilding, trying to piece together what had been lost. The Sumerian king list might be one of those pieces, a fragment of antediluvian knowledge, distorted and incomplete, but genuine. The impossibly long reigns, the mysterious cities, the flood that divided history, all of it might be a garbled but authentic memory of a world that the gods tried to erase. There's an odd detail in the mythology surrounding the antediluvian kings that deserves attention. Several of these kings are said to have ascended to heaven, to have been taken up by the gods without dying. Enmeduranki, the seventh antediluvian king who ruled in Sipar, is particularly important. According to later Babylonian tradition, Enmeduranki was taken up into heaven where the gods Shamash and Adad taught him the secrets of divination, how to read omens, how to interpret the will of the gods, how to see the future. He then returned to earth and taught these secrets to the priests, establishing the guild of diviners that would serve Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. This story has clear parallels to the biblical figure of Enoch, the seventh patriarch before the flood, who walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch, like Enmeduranki, was taken up to heaven and given divine knowledge, which he then recorded in books that became the foundation for later mystical and apocalyptic traditions. The parallel is too precise to be coincidental. Both are the seventh in a series of antediluvian figures. Both are taken up to heaven. Both receive divine knowledge. Both transmit that knowledge to later generations. The two traditions must be connected, must stem from a common source. a memory of an antediluvian figure who bridged the gap between human and divine, who brought down knowledge from heaven and ensured that it would survive the coming flood. What kind of knowledge? The texts are maddeningly vague, but they hint at astronomy, at the movements of the heavens, at the ability to calculate and predict celestial events. Enmeduranki is taught divination, which in Mesopotamian practice meant observing and interpreting natural phenomena, the flight of birds, the patterns in oil poured on water, the movements of stars and planets, the occurrence of eclipses. This was not superstition. It was science, a systematic attempt to understand the patterns that govern the natural world and to use that understanding to predict future events. If the antediluvian kings possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, if they were tracking celestial cycles and recording their observations over thousands of years, then the numbers in the king list might be more than just reign lengths. They might be a kind of code, a way of encoding astronomical data in a form that could be transmitted across the catastrophe of the flood. The reigns of the kings might correspond to celestial cycles, to the periods of planets, to precession of the equinoxes, to cycles within cycles that the antediluvian astronomers had discovered and wanted to preserve. And if that's true, then the king list is not just a historical document, it's a scientific text, a repository of astronomical knowledge so important that it had to be saved, even if that meant disguising it as a list of kings and dynasties. The Sumerians who recorded the king list might not have fully understood what they were preserving. They might have been copying from sources that were already ancient, already mysterious, already partially incomprehensible. But they recognized that the information was important, that it came from a time before the flood, and that it needed to be recorded and passed down. Let's turn now to a question we've been avoiding. If the antediluvian civilization was so advanced, where is the archaeological evidence? Where are the ruins of Eridu from before the flood? Where are the artifacts, the tools, the technologies that this lost civilization would have left behind? The answer might be simpler than we think: underwater. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 400 feet. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were suddenly submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. If the antediluvian cities were built along those ancient coastlines, and there's good reason to think they would have been, since river mouths and coastal areas are the most fertile and resource-rich locations, then those cities are now underwater, buried beneath centuries of sediment, completely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. Recent underwater archaeology has revealed that there are indeed structures, settlements, and artifacts beneath the world's oceans. Off the coast of India, underwater ruins have been discovered that some researchers date to 7000 BCE or earlier. In the Mediterranean, submerged settlements have been found that predate any known coastal civilizations. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a massive stone structure that may be natural or may be artificial, sits beneath the waves, a mystery that continues to provoke debate. If we accept that sea level rise submerged thousands of miles of coastline at the end of the Ice Age, then we have to accept that whatever civilizations existed along those coastlines are now lost, visible only to divers and underwater robots. The archaeological record, in other words, is incomplete, radically, fundamentally incomplete. We're looking for evidence of ancient civilizations in the wrong places, in the highlands and river valleys that remained above water, when the real centres of ancient population might be beneath the seas. Eridu, as it happens, was originally a coastal city. When it was founded around 5400 BCE, it stood near the edge of the Persian Gulf. Over the millennia, silt from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers gradually extended the coastline, pushing the sea further and further away. Today, Eridu is miles inland, surrounded by desert. But in the antediluvian period, if that period predates 5400 BCE, Eridu would have been a coastal settlement, possibly even a port city. If the antediluvian cities were built during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower, then they would have been located along what is now the floor of the Persian Gulf. And when the ice melted and the seas rose, those cities would have been flooded, destroyed, buried beneath water and sediment. Only the memory of those cities would have survived, preserved in oral traditions and eventually recorded in texts like the Sumerian king list. This would explain why the archaeological evidence for the antediluvian cities is so sparse. We've excavated Eridu, and we've found layers of settlement going back to 5400 BCE, but we haven't found the antediluvian city, the original Eridu where Alulim reigned for 28th Bayun the 800 years. That city, if it existed, is underwater, out of reach, lost beneath the Persian Gulf. The final question, the one that haunts every reading of the Sumerian king list, is this. What does it mean for us? Why should we care about a list of ancient kings, about a flood that may or may not have happened, about a lost civilization that may or may not have existed? We live in the 21st century, in a world of science and technology, of space exploration and artificial intelligence. What possible relevance could the Sumerian king list have to our lives today? The answer is that the king list challenges our fundamental understanding of human history. We've been taught that civilization is a recent phenomenon, that humans lived as primitive hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years and only developed agriculture, cities and writing within the last 10,000 years. We've been taught that history is a story of progress, of steady advancement from simplicity to complexity, from ignorance to knowledge. But the Sumerian king list tells a different story. It tells us that there were civilizations before ours, that there were kings and cities and knowledge that existed long before the earliest dates in our history books. It tells us that history is not linear but cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be gained and lost, that humanity has had to start over more than once. If the king list is right, if there really was an antediluvian civilization that was destroyed by a catastrophic flood, then we need to rethink everything we know about the human past. We need to consider the possibility that we are not the first advanced civilization, that there were others before us, and that those earlier civilizations might have known things we don't, might have achieved things we haven't, might have left behind knowledge that we've lost. And if civilizations can fall, if knowledge can be lost, if catastrophe can destroy everything we've built, then we need to ask ourselves, could it happen again? Are we building a civilization that's sustainable, that will endure, that will pass its knowledge down to future generations? Or are we repeating the mistakes of the past, building on unstable foundations, heading toward our own flood, our own moment when everything we've built will be swept away? The Sumerian king list is not just a window into the past, it's a mirror, reflecting back to us our own fragility, our own mortality, our own place in the long cycle of human history. It reminds us that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, not the final destination of progress. We are one chapter in a much longer story, a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone. The antediluvian kings are calling to us across the millennia, their names carved into clay, their reigns stretching across vast epochs of time. They're telling us that the world has changed before and will change again, that nothing is permanent, that even the greatest civilizations eventually crumble and fall. But they're also telling us something else, something more hopeful, that memory survives, that knowledge can be preserved, that even after the flood, after the catastrophe, after everything is lost, something can be saved. The Sumerian king list survived. Despite 4,000 years of wars, invasions, collapses and catastrophes, despite the fall of Sumer and the destruction of its cities, despite the death of its language and the loss of its culture, the king list survived. It was copied and recopied, buried and rediscovered, translated and studied, until finally it reached us, here, now, in the 21st century. That's the real miracle of the Sumerian king list. Not the impossibly long reigns, not the mysterious antediluvian kings, not even the flood that divided history. The miracle is that it survived at all, that the memory was kept alive, that someone cared enough to preserve it. And if the Sumerians could do that, if they could save their knowledge across thousands of years of chaos and destruction, then maybe we can too. Maybe that's the lesson the antediluvian kings are trying to teach us. Not to fear the flood, not to mourn what will be lost, but to do what the Sumerians did, to remember, to record, to preserve, to carve our knowledge into something that will last, something that will survive whatever catastrophes the future holds, something that will speak to whoever comes after us and tell them, "We were here, we knew things, and we wanted you to know them too." The Sumerian king list is still waiting, still speaking, still asking its questions, and maybe, if we listen carefully enough, we'll find not just answers about the past, but guidance for the future. Wisdom from a lost world, preserved across the ages, offering us a chance to learn from those who came before, to avoid their mistakes, to build something that will last. Or maybe the king list is simply reminding us that some mysteries can't be solved, that some questions can't be answered, that the past will always remain partly hidden, partly unknowable. And that's okay, because the value of the mystery is not in solving it, but in carrying it with us, in letting it shape how we see the world, in allowing it to remind us that reality is stranger and deeper and more wondrous than we can ever fully comprehend. The antediluvian kings ruled for thousands of years in cities that no longer exist, in a world that was swept away by a flood. But their names remain, their memory endures, and as long as we continue to ask questions about them, to wonder about them, to imagine the world they inhabited, they are, in a sense, still alive, still ruling, still speaking, still bridging the gap between the earliest past and the present moment. What if that's immortality? Not living for 28,000 years in a physical body, but living forever in memory, in story, in the questions that each generation asks anew. What if the antediluvian kings achieved something far more remarkable than longevity? They achieved permanence, eternity, a kind of existence that transcends time itself. The clay tablets will eventually crumble, the museums will eventually fall, but the story will remain, passed from mind to mind, generation to generation, carried forward into whatever future awaits us. The Sumerian king list will continue to speak, continue to ask, continue to challenge our understanding of who we are and where we came from. And in that persistence, in that refusal to be forgotten, there might be the answer to the greatest mystery of all. Not how long the antediluvian kings lived, but why their memory has endured. Not what happened before the flood, but why we need to keep asking that question. Not whether the king list is true or false, history or mythology, but why it continues to matter, continues to haunt us, continues to call us back to the beginning, to the earliest past, to the moment when kingship descended from heaven and everything began. The Sumerian king list holds the key to our earliest past, but perhaps it also holds the key to our future, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost and found, that memory is the most precious thing we possess, and that the greatest gift we can give to those who come after us is the truth of where we came from, however strange, however impossible, however difficult to believe. The kings are waiting. The cities are silent. The flood is remembered. And the question echoes across 4,000 years. What if it's all true? What if the Sumerians were right? What if there were a world before this world? And what if some part of that world is still trying to speak to us, still trying to tell us something we desperately need to know? Listen, the clay is still speaking.